Hey, Cosmo here. Welcome to this, my first attempt at going over the fundamentals of coding in Python. Now I know what you're thinking, how could I possibly be teaching you how to do Python when I'm standing here fishing by a lake? But don't worry, I'm going to finish up what I'm doing here, a nice relaxing morning, doing some fishing, and head back to our little house up there, and I can show you through what we're going to be covering today. So let's get our Carrot Mac booted up and we can get started with this. So to code along with this series, I recommend installing Python on your computer. The best thing to do is to get hold of Thonny for Python, which is Thonny for Python. If you had a look for that on the internet, you should be able to go to thonny.org and get hold of the installer. I'm currently running on a Mac, but you've obviously got Windows there and Linux if you so needed to. But once you've got it installed, get it booted up, and we can get around with learning the basics of coding in Python. So I've just installed Thonny, and the first thing I did when I opened it up was go up to View and have a look for what other windows you can see. And I started switching these on because for me, as a developer, it makes more sense to be able to see what's going on in the background. Files would be useful if you had multiple files you're working with, but for now it's probably going to work with one file at a time. We don't really need that to be taking up the screen space, but personally I would turn on pretty much all these other views that we have available here. Object Inspector, Outline, let's go with Program Tree, sure, why not? May not need to use it, but it's worth having it there. Stack, let's have that one on as well, and Variables. So that should be good. So we've got Variables, Helper, Outline, Notes. This is useful, so you can just literally write stuff down. There's a little scratch pad as you're thinking about what you want to do. Outline, I assume we'll outline as we run things. The Helper's always worth having open. Whenever they build applications like this, the development team take a lot of effort into writing help documentation to go along with it to help outline more information. So it's really worth opening this up and having a go through. Before I start writing any scripts, let's have a play around with what the shell can be useful for. So this shell in this state is just where we run our commands. So when we run a script, the script will run through our functions and output whatever we need it to do, and it will run our program. But in this state, I can just type like a calculator, 1 + 1 = 2. So it understands maths and basic logic. So 2 times 3 will output 6. But just think of this as a really, really clever calculator. So let's go from beyond there. So if we do 2 to the power of 3, so this double times here is saying to the power of, so we're doing 2 times 2, which is 4, 4 times 2, which would then equal 8. So the next operator worth learning about is called the modulus operator, or the remainder. So for example, if we do 10 remainder 3, right, so what's it actually going to do? So let's go with creating this simple logic here. So 10 goes into 3 times, which would be 9. So 10 minus 9 would then equal 1. So the remainder of 10 into 3 would equal 1. Okay, so if I do 9 remainder 3, 3 goes into 9 3 times perfectly, so the remainder should be 0. Okay, so then if I was to do 5, for example, if I do 9 remainder 5, right, so we know 9 goes into 5 once, and the remainder would then be 4. Okay, and then if I do 10 remainder 5, 10 goes into 5 twice perfectly, and the remainder would be 0. So as you can see here, we can use this modulus operator for some quite useful logic, which we'll go on to later on in our scripts. But for now, just have a play around with doing some basic maths in here and get to understand what these things are actually doing. So the next thing I want to cover before we go on to anything else more fun are variables, which are another fundamental building block of coding. Now, in languages I work with, we tend to assign variables with a prefix. You'd say like let or const. This is like JavaScript syntax. But for Python, which we're working with in here, you can just simply assign things by giving them an equal value. If we were to say x equals 1 and return x equals 1. And if I was to say x plus 3 and return that, we get 4 because x is equal to the value of 1 and it understands the assignment. So x is 1 plus 3 then becomes 4. If I was to do y equals 4 and just type y and hit enter, we get back 4. So it stands to reason if I was to do x plus y, we get 5. Okay, I can also do things like this. So I can do x equals x plus y, enter. Now what do you think x is worth? Because x used to be worth 1, x is now equal 5. So now I've reassigned x, even though I used x in itself, at the time it still equaled 1, x now equals the returned value of x plus y. So variables don't have to just be numbers or integers, they can also be strings or other functions. So for example, if I was to do name equals Cosmo, return name, it should output Cosmo. So it understands, and you see it's put it in quotes here, so it knows it's a string, whereas here it's an integer. So if I was to do num equals 1 and return num, 1 is now a string because it's in quotes, rather than an integer of 1. So this is actually important to pay attention to. Things that are quoted are strings, but we can come on to this in more detail later, but it's worth paying attention to this. Now in Python, I don't know if it's smart enough to be able to do maths on that. It's not. You see, it'll fall over because I'm trying to apply a string plus an integer, and it then doesn't like it because we're trying to concatenate a string which is not an integer. So this is what it's complaining about, which it does make sense, right? We're trying to get a string, which is the word, even though it's the character of 1, this is basically the word 1 plus an integer. So just pay attention to things like this. You can trip people over when you're trying to do maths on strings. So the next fun thing to try and do with variables, I think, would be something like this. So if I do first name equals Cosmo, and output first name Cosmo. Now I tend to write variables in a way where this is called camel cased. So every time you go onto a new word, you put the first letter of that word in uppercase. I just realised it's called camel case because it's got a hump in the middle. But the actual entire variable starts with a lowercase. We can come on to casings later on, but this is just a nice way of making things readable. If I was to call it first name, it's not as easy to read. At first glance, it's harder to work out what that says, whereas when it's written like this, it's just a good way of writing. Some people do actually do things like this as well. Neither are wrong, they still work. It's just what people tend to do as a convention, so just bear that in mind. So also I can do things like this. So last name equals attempts, bam. So last name attempts. So I can do full name equals first name plus last name. And look what happens here. So if I do full name and hit enter, it says Cosmo attempts. But you see there's no space here because it literally took the value of first name, it added them together. So it squashed Cosmo and attempts to become Cosmo attempts, which from a gamer tag, it works. But what you'd really want to do, plus a space, plus last name. So now if we do this, which would be full name equals first name plus a space in between quotes plus last name. Now if we see what full name returns, it's Cosmo space attempts. So again, things like this we've got to pay attention to. When we're working with numbers or integers, the plus will do this. When we're working with strings, it will concatenate the strings together, so it will just throw them together. But we've got to be wary of things like spaces that will be missing if you don't specifically pass them through into the concatenation. So what I was just doing now is do this for yourself. So enter your first name equals, do your last name equals, and then reassign them to full name. And maybe even do age equals, and try creating a sentence out of adding those things together. So hi, my name is, I am years old. Something like that. So as a little test for you, have a go at doing that yourself. And then when we come back, we'll have a look at writing our first script where we can actually output that from a script file rather than in the shell terminal. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.